A leaky pipe was supposed to be a simple fix, but when James, the rugged and confident plumber, arrived, everything changed. His steady hands, his quiet strength, it all drew me in. And when his touch lingered, when his kiss finally came, it wasn't just heat. It was something deeper, something that made the ordinary feel extraordinary. A chance encounter is a story about connection, vulnerability, and the sparks that turn routine into something unforgettable. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The rhythmic drip 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 had become my unwelcome companion, echoing from beneath the bathroom sink. At first, I ignored it, hoping it might miraculously stop on its own. Denial is such a reliable first step when things go wrong. But by day 3, a small puddle had started to form, and each passing hour seemed to make the sound sharper, more insistent, like the leak was mocking me for my inaction. I crouched down to assess the damage, peering under the cabinet. A maze of pipes and fittings greeted me, each one more inscrutable than the last. It didn't look catastrophic, just a steady stream of droplets trickling from one of the connectors. "I can handle this," I muttered to myself, feeling a misplaced surge of confidence. Armed with a wrench and a YouTube tutorial, I gave it my best shot. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. After several minutes of fumbling and accidentally tightening the wrong thing, I managed to make the leak worse. Water started spraying in a fine mist, soaking my sleeves and the inside of the cabinet. I threw the wrench down with a frustrated groan and grabbed a towel to clean up the mess. That was when I admitted defeat. I needed a professional. Pulling out my phone, I searched for plumbers in my area. There were plenty of options, but most of the reviews read like horror stories. Missed appointments, exorbitant fees, or shoddy work. Finally, I found a small local business with glowing recommendations. I dialed the number, and a friendly voice answered almost immediately.
Summers Plumbing.
"How can I help you?" I explained the situation, trying not to sound too panicked. The man on the other end, Sam, was calm and reassuring. He promised to send someone first thing in the morning. Relieved, I thanked him and hung up, but the sound of the drip still haunted me. The next morning, I woke up early to tidy up. My apartment was nothing fancy. A one-bedroom rental with mismatched furniture and more personality than style, but it felt like an extension of me. I shoved a few stray dishes into the sink, fluffed the pillows on the couch, and gave the bathroom a once-over to make it somewhat presentable. When the doorbell finally rang at 9 a.m., I was half expecting a grizzled old man in overalls. Instead, I opened the door to find someone entirely different. Standing on my doorstep was a tall man in a clean, fitted uniform. He looked to be in his early 30s with short, slightly messy brown hair and an easy, confident smile. His frame was broad, his shoulders strong, and his hands, large and calloused, clutched a toolbox. "Morning," he said warmly, his voice smooth but unassuming. "I'm James. Here for the plumbing issue?" I froze for a second, caught off guard by his presence. Yeah, bathroom's this way," I stammered, stepping aside to let him in. As James walked past me, I caught a faint whiff of something clean and earthy, like cedarwood soap. Suddenly, I felt very aware of my rumpled pajamas and unbrushed hair. "This should be quick," he said with a reassuring smile. "Let's take a look." And just like that, my quiet morning had taken an unexpected turn. James followed me into the bathroom, toolbox in hand. The small space suddenly felt even smaller with him standing there, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the doorframe as he surveyed the sink. "Nice place," he said casually, kneeling to inspect the cabinet. "Thanks," I mumbled, glancing around as if seeing the room for the first time. The mirror over the sink reflected my messy hair and tired eyes, and I cringed. Why hadn't I taken 2 minutes to fix myself up? My pajamas, a faded t-shirt and flannel pants, suddenly felt embarrassingly casual. James opened the cabinet and leaned in to get a closer look. The way his movements were so deliberate, so practiced, held my attention in a way that surprised me. He pulled out a small flashlight and flicked it on, the beam illuminating the leaky pipe. "Here's the culprit," he said, his voice steady. "Looks like the joint is worn out. It's an easy fix, but it'll take a bit of work to make sure it doesn't start again in a week." "Right?" I replied, nodding as if I had any idea what he was talking about. He glanced up at me, and I felt a twinge of self-consciousness under his gaze. His eyes were warm and sharp, the kind that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "Don't worry, I've got it under control," he added with a smile that was so easy, so genuine, that it caught me off guard. I forced myself to focus on anything else. "Do you need, towels or anything?" I asked, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. "I'll need a bucket if you've got one." "Towels couldn't hurt either," he replied, his tone professional but kind. "Right, bucket, towels. Be right back," I said, retreating to the kitchen like it was some kind of sanctuary. As I rummaged under the sink for a bucket, my mind raced. Why was I so nervous? It wasn't like this was anything more than a routine plumbing call. Yet there was something about James, his calm demeanor, his quiet confidence, that had me on edge in a way I couldn't quite explain. When I returned with the bucket and a stack of towels, James had already laid out a few tools beside the sink. He took the bucket with a quick thanks, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. That small contact shouldn't have meant anything. It was just a practical exchange. But for some reason, it felt like the air between us shifted, just slightly. "So," James said as he crouched down to position the bucket under the pipe, "how long has it been leaking?" A few days," I admitted. "I tried to fix it myself, but let's just say plumbing isn't one of my strong suits." He chuckled softly, the sound low and rich. "Most people think it's easier than it is. But you did the right thing calling for help." "Yeah," I said, watching him as he worked. "Guess I got lucky with who they sent." His smile widened, though he didn't look up. "Flattery won't get the leak fixed faster, but I appreciate it." I bit my lip to hide a nervous laugh, unsure if I just embarrassed myself or stumbled into something else entirely. James got to work with an air of calm focus that made me feel like I was watching something oddly satisfying. He adjusted the flashlight, making sure it illuminated the leaky joint, then reached for a wrench from his neatly organized toolbox. The clink of metal against metal was oddly soothing, a rhythmic sound that mirrored the methodical way he moved. I leaned against the doorframe, trying not to hover but finding it impossible to look away. He worked with a kind of quiet confidence, his hands steady and sure as he loosened one of the fittings. The muscles in his forearms flexed as he applied pressure, and I found myself staring before I could catch myself. "So, do you do this a lot?" I blurted, desperate to break the silence and distract myself from where my thoughts were going. James glanced up at me, his lips curling into a slight smile. "What, plumbing?" "Yeah," I said quickly. "I mean, obviously you do, but, is it your main job? Or do you just fix leaky sinks for fun?" He laughed softly, the sound low and pleasant. "It's my main gig, yeah. Been doing it for about 6 years now. Before that, I worked construction, but I wanted something with steadier hours." I nodded, suddenly curious. "Do you like it?" "It's not bad," he said, tightening a fitting with one fluid motion. "It's honest work, keeps me busy, and every once in a while, I get to meet interesting people." He glanced up at me when he said the last part, and I felt my stomach do a strange little flip. I managed a nervous laugh. "I'm not sure interesting is the word I'd use for me. You should have seen me trying to fix that leak on my own. It was a disaster." "Well, you tried," he said with a shrug. "That's more than most people would do. Besides, it's not like plumbing is intuitive. I've seen worse messes." "Really?" I asked, crossing my arms. "What's the worst you've seen?" He hesitated, then chuckled. "Let's just say I've walked into a few homes where the pipes were practically held together with duct tape. People get creative when they're desperate." I laughed, feeling the tension in my chest ease a little. "Okay, I'll admit that makes me feel better about my failed attempt." He grinned but didn't respond, his focus shifting back to the pipe. I watched as he worked, the conversation fading into a comfortable silence. There was something oddly intimate about the whole scene. Him kneeling on the bathroom floor, his hands expertly maneuvering around the pipes, while I stood a few feet away, trying to pretend I wasn't studying every detail of him. I couldn't help noticing the small things. The way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his fingers moved with precision, the slight crease in the corner of his mouth when he muttered something under his breath. "Can you hand me that rag?" he asked suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Oh yeah, sure," I said, grabbing the cloth from the counter. I leaned forward to pass it to him, and as he took it, our fingers brushed again. This time it lingered for just a second too long. My breath caught, and I was certain he noticed, though he didn't say anything. Instead, he shifted his focus back to the pipe, but there was a new tension in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. More like an unspoken awareness that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. "This should do it," he said after a few more minutes of tightening and adjusting. "I'm just going to test it to make sure everything's sealed." He turned the water back on, and we both watched as it flowed smoothly through the pipe. No sign of the dreaded drip. "All fixed," he said, wiping his hands on the rag. "Good as new." "That's a relief," I said, exhaling as if I'd been holding my breath. "You're a lifesaver." "Just doing my job," he replied, though the way he smiled made it feel like there was more to the moment than that. I felt my cheeks warm and quickly looked away, pretending to inspect the cabinet. "Well, thanks. Seriously, I'd probably still be fighting with it if you hadn't come." "It's what I'm here for," he said simply, but his voice held a warmth that made the words linger. As he gathered his tools and stood up, I felt the strange sense that this wasn't just another day for either of us. James wiped his hands on the rag before tossing it into the bucket, his movements deliberate and calm. I tried not to stare, but there was something about the way he carried himself, like everything he did had a purpose. "Anything else leaking that I should take a look at while I'm here?" he asked, his voice casual but with an undertone that felt oddly personal. I hesitated. "Actually, yeah, the kitchen sink's been acting up. I think the faucet's a little loose, but I wasn't sure if it was worth bothering anyone about." "Let's check it out," he said, picking up his toolbox. I led him to the kitchen, suddenly hyper-aware of how close we were in the narrow hallway. His shoulder brushed against the wall as he followed me, and I could feel the warmth of him just behind me. "This is it," I said, stepping aside as we reached the sink. He crouched down immediately, inspecting the pipes beneath. I leaned against the counter, watching as he worked. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it felt heavy, like the space between words mattered more than the words themselves. I could hear the faint clinking of his tools, the soft sound of his breath as he muttered something under his own. "Mind handing me that wrench?" he asked, gesturing to the counter where he'd set it earlier. "Sure," I said, picking it up and leaning down to pass it to him. Our hands brushed again, this time more deliberate than accidental. My fingers grazed his for a moment too long, and I saw the way his jaw tightened slightly, the faintest flicker of something in his expression. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter now. "Sure," I replied, but my voice wavered slightly, betraying the way my pulse had quickened. He adjusted the faucet with a measured twist of the wrench, his focus never wavering, but the charged atmosphere between us only grew thicker. It wasn't just the physical closeness. It was the way the moments stretched, the unspoken weight of every glance, every shift in posture. "So," he said after a while, breaking the silence but keeping his tone light, "you live here alone?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me from where he was crouched. "Yeah, just me. It's not much, but it's home. It's nice," he said, glancing up at me briefly. "Cozy. Feels like it suits you." I blinked, caught off guard. Thanks. I think." He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "It's a compliment. Not everyone's place has personality, you know?" I smiled, unsure of how to respond. The moment felt strangely intimate, like he'd seen something about me that most people overlooked. He finished tightening the faucet and stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That should do it," he said, his tone returning to a professional cadence. "Great," I said, though my voice sounded too bright, like I was trying to fill the silence that followed. "Thanks again." He nodded, but instead of packing up his tools immediately, he leaned back slightly against the counter, his eyes meeting mine. There was a pause, a lingering moment where neither of us spoke. "Funny thing," he said after a beat, his voice quieter now, "this is usually just another day for me. Fixing leaks, tightening pipes. Pretty straightforward." I tilted my head, unsure where he was going with this. But, he hesitated, his gaze steady. "Sometimes things feel a little different. You know what I mean?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think I do." The corners of his mouth lifted in a faint smile, and for a moment, I felt like the rest of the world had disappeared. James crouched down again, this time inspecting the pipes beneath the kitchen sink. The dim light above the counter cast shadows across his broad shoulders, accentuating the quiet strength in the way he moved. I stood nearby, leaning against the fridge, trying to seem casual but feeling anything but. The kitchen felt impossibly small with both of us in it. The counter pressed against my back, and James's proximity filled the space with an energy that was hard to ignore. His movements were slow and deliberate, his focus unwavering, but every now and then, I caught him glancing at me. "So," I said, breaking the silence that had stretched too long, "what's the verdict? Another catastrophic leak?" "Not quite," he replied, his voice calm but with a hint of amusement. "Just a loose connection. Easy fix." I nodded, unsure of what to say next. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it felt heavy, like something unspoken was hanging in the air. James adjusted the pipe with a practiced hand, the faint clinking of his tools the only sound in the room. As he worked, I found my attention drifting again. The way his hands moved, strong and sure, but with a kind of precision, was oddly mesmerizing. I caught myself staring and quickly looked away, hoping he hadn't noticed. "You're quiet all of a sudden," he said, glancing up at me with a small smile. "Just giving you space to focus," I said, my voice lighter than I felt. "Appreciate that," he said with a chuckle, but the warmth in his tone made it clear he didn't mind the company. The moment passed, and James finished tightening the connection. He shifted slightly, reaching for a different tool, and his shoulder brushed against my leg. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. "Sorry," he said, looking up briefly. "It's fine," I replied quickly, my voice a little too sharp. He paused, his eyes meeting mine for a moment that felt like it stretched far too long. There was something in his expression, curiosity maybe, or something deeper, that made it hard to look away. "Almost done," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Take your time," I replied, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite explain. James finished the adjustment and stood up, his movements fluid and unhurried. The space between us felt impossibly small as he leaned back slightly against the counter, his arms resting at his sides. "All set," he said, his voice low but steady. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound normal. But instead of stepping away, he stayed where he was, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could name. The silence grew heavier, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that begged to be broken, but neither of us seemed willing to do it just yet. Finally, he smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that felt almost shy. "You're easy to talk to, you know that?" "Am I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he said softly. "You are." And for a moment, the kitchen didn't feel so small anymore. James lingered near the sink, his hands resting on the counter behind him. The air between us felt charged, like an invisible thread pulled taut, waiting for someone to either cut it or let it snap. "I don't usually stick around after a job," he said, his voice soft but steady. I tilted my head, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor before returning to me. "Most of the time it's in and out. Fix the issue, hand over the invoice, move on to the next. Routine." I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. "Makes sense. But this," he continued, gesturing vaguely between us, "doesn't feel routine." My breath caught, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined the words. The way he was looking at me, steady but uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he'd crossed a line, made my chest tighten. "No," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Felt like standing on the edge of something, like the next step would change everything. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if this is the right time or place to say this, but—" "Say what?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. He hesitated, his hand dropping back to his side. "You're easy to be around. There's something about you. Something I can't quite put my finger on, but it feels different." The words settled between us, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what to say, but the way he was looking at me made it clear he didn't expect an immediate response. "I guess what I'm trying to say is—" He paused, his voice quieter now. "This doesn't feel like just another job." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "You're not the only one who feels that way," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. His shoulders relaxed, and the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Good to know it's not just me," he said softly. Before I could think too much about it, he reached out and placed his hand lightly over mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of warmth through me that was impossible to ignore. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the words. "Yeah," I managed to say, my throat dry. "It's okay." His thumb brushed against the back of my hand, a small but deliberate gesture that made my pulse race. It wasn't much, but it was enough to say everything we weren't ready to put into words. For the first time since he'd arrived, I felt like I wasn't standing on the edge anymore. I'd already stepped forward, and so had he. For a moment, neither of us moved. James's hand rested lightly over mine, his thumb tracing small, deliberate circles on my skin. The warmth of his touch seemed to seep through me, settling in my chest and making it hard to breathe. "This feels unexpected," he said, his voice low and steady. I nodded, barely trusting myself to speak. "Yeah, it does." His eyes searched mine, as if looking for some kind of permission, some assurance that this wasn't one-sided. I could feel my heart racing, the pulse in my ears loud enough to drown out everything else. He leaned in slightly, his movements slow and careful, like he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning in too, drawn to him in a way that felt completely beyond my control. When his lips finally met mine, it was soft and tentative, like the first note of a song you weren't sure you were ready to hear. The kiss was warm, his lips firm but gentle, and I felt something inside me unravel, like all the tension and uncertainty that had been building between us finally found its release. I let my eyes flutter shut, my free hand reaching up to lightly rest against his shoulder. He responded by deepening the kiss, his other hand moving to cup the side of my face. The touch was grounding, steadying me in a moment that felt like it might sweep me away. When we finally broke apart, it wasn't with a sense of awkwardness or regret. Instead, there was a kind of quiet understanding between us, like we'd both known this was where things were headed all along. "I wasn't sure if that was a good idea," he said softly, his forehead resting against mine. "Why not?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He pulled back slightly, his eyes meeting mine. "Because I don't want this to feel like just another passing moment. You're different. This is different." His words settled heavily between us, but they didn't feel like a burden. They felt real, honest in a way that made me want to say something equally vulnerable in return. It doesn't feel that way to me either, I admitted, my hand still resting lightly on his shoulder. He smiled at that, his expression softening in a way that made my chest ache. Good, he said simply. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us feeling more comfortable than it ever had. He reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face, the gesture so tender it made my heart skip a beat. I should probably finish up, he said eventually, his voice tinged with reluctance. Right? I replied, stepping back to give him space, though I immediately missed the warmth of his presence. He crouched down to pack up his tools, his movements unhurried but precise. I leaned against the counter, watching him, the lingering sensation of his kiss still fresh on my lips. When he stood up again, his toolbox in hand, he looked at me with a smile that felt like a promise. All set. No more leaks. Thanks, I said, trying to sound normal, though my voice felt lighter than it had in years. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to say something else before finally speaking. Maybe I could see you again sometime? Outside of fixing pipes, I mean. The question caught me off guard, but in the best way. I'd like that, I said, the words coming out more easily than I expected. His smile widened, and I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the kiss we'd just shared. Good, he said. I'll be in touch. With that, he turned and headed for the door, leaving me standing in the kitchen, still feeling like I was floating somewhere just above the ground. After James left, the apartment felt strangely quiet, as though it were holding its breath. I stood in the kitchen, my fingers brushing the edge of the counter where I'd leaned only minutes ago, replaying everything that had just happened. The kiss, his touch, the way he'd looked at me like I wasn't just another job on his list. It all felt surreal, like stepping into a scene from a movie I hadn't realized I was part of until it was too late. I moved to the sink, turning the faucet on and off just to reassure myself that everything was working as it should. The water flowed smoothly, no sign of the irritating drip that had brought James here in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on me. A leaky pipe had been the catalyst for something I couldn't have anticipated if I'd tried. I wandered into the living room and sank onto the couch, pulling my knees up to my chest. The faint scent of cedarwood soap still lingered in the air, a reminder of James's presence that made the space feel less empty. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my thoughts. For a split second, I hoped it might be him, but it was just a weather alert. I laughed softly at my own ridiculousness, running a hand through my hair. Get it together, Casey, I muttered under my breath. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on something else, my mind kept circling back to him. The quiet confidence in the way he worked, the warmth in his eyes when he'd spoken to me, the softness of his voice when he'd asked to see me again. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of something I'd thought I'd lost: hope. By the time evening rolled around, the sun dipping low in the sky and casting golden light through the apartment windows, I was still lost in my thoughts. Every so often, I'd catch myself smiling, the memory of James's smile playing like a loop in my head. The sound of a car engine starting outside drew my attention to the window. I stood, pulling back the curtain just in time to see a familiar blue van pulling away from the curb. It was him. He must have sat there for a while, maybe making a call or finishing paperwork. Or maybe, no, I shook the thought from my mind. I was overthinking it. Still, the idea that he might have hesitated before leaving made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't sure I understood yet. I sat back down, running my fingers along the worn fabric of the couch. Maybe it wasn't about understanding everything right now. Maybe it was enough to know that something had shifted, that today wasn't just another ordinary day. As I glanced at the sink one more time, I couldn't help but laugh. A leaky pipe had fixed more than just my plumbing. As I sat on the couch, the faint hum of the city filtering through the window, I couldn't stop reflecting on the events of the day. Everything about it felt surreal, like it belonged to someone else's story, not mine. But here I was, replaying James's words in my mind, the soft way he'd said I was different, the quiet vulnerability in his eyes when he asked if he could see me again. It was hard to wrap my head around how a leaky pipe had turned into something so unexpected, so meaningful. I looked around my apartment, the same space I'd woken up in this morning, yet it felt different somehow. Warmer, maybe, or maybe I was the one who had changed. This wasn't the kind of thing I normally shared with anyone. I was the type to keep my stories to myself, to let moments like these fade into memories only I carried. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe this was a story worth telling. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded me how extraordinary the ordinary could be. I reached for my laptop, still sitting open on the coffee table, and pulled it into my lap. With a few keystrokes, I opened a blank document. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I started to type. Sometimes, life surprises you in the smallest ways. A leaky pipe, a knock at the door, a stranger who somehow doesn't feel like a stranger at all. And sometimes, those surprises remind you that even the most mundane moments can change everything. I leaned back, staring at the words on the screen. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I saved the document, the title glaring back at me. A chance encounter, and just like that, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning.